Jessica with Mother Earth News, and today I'm going to be talking about container gardening in small spaces. I'm going to just share some tips for beginner container gardeners on some things to consider as you plan and execute your container gardening, as well as some of the things that I've learned as I've done some container gardening. A lot of my experience comes from doing the wrong thing and figuring out what doesn't work, but it still helps me just the same plan for future seasons. Container gardening can really be for anybody. You might have a large piece of property, but you still want to garden in containers. And that might be because you feel like you want to just start with containers and then go from there. It could be because the soil on your property is just not suitable for plants and you would rather garden in containers. Maybe you want to stay clear of some of the pests and diseases that could come to your plants if you planted it in the soil. Sometimes gardening in containers will help you mitigate some of those threats. Or maybe you are like me, where you live in a small space and really container gardening is the most feasible thing you can do. For context, I live in a 2-bedroom apartment. I live in Northeast Kansas in Zone 6A, and I really don't have a yard. I absolutely don't have a yard. I have a patio on the east side of my apartment, so the front of the apartment. I have about a 6-foot by 8-foot patio with a cement floor, so not really much soil to work with. And then on the back side, there is a small stretch of space between the fence that's the end of my apartment complex and the back side of my apartment. It's not technically my property, but there is some potential there if I want to work with my apartment complex to see if I can put some containers back there. So really no yard, no soil, that's the space I have. So just a little bit of outdoor space, mainly indoor space, and whatever sunlight I can rely on. And so if you're living in a small space, you might feel like you can't garden, but container gardening can be a really great alternative. And just with a little creativity and looking at your space a different way, you can start to see the possibilities that come with container gardening in a small space. And so I have 3 different points I wanted to share with you that have helped me as I've container gardened, and hopefully that inspires you and helps you start to think about how you want to utilize your space. And the first thing I would want to share is, before you even think about getting any plants, is to evaluate your space. And that includes how much sunlight you get in your space. So when I first moved in here less than a year ago, I took some time to really just understand what wildlife is around me, how much direct sunlight I can rely on, and exactly how much space I have to work with. And so some of the things that I would recommend you doing is just taking a couple days and seeing, one, how much light are you getting and where is it coming from? So for example, for me, I have east and west facing windows, so I get some reliable direct sunlight for a few hours each day on both sides. But maybe you find you have indirect sunlight, or maybe no light at all, if just a little bit. And that's gonna help inform you what type of plants are really gonna thrive. You could potentially get plants that need more sunlight than that. I remember a few years ago, just because I really wanted a tomato plant, I got a tomato plant, and I was living in an apartment that maybe got 3 hours of direct sunlight, give or take. So I only got maybe 2 tomatoes. But it was really fun to have it, and I just had to accept the fact that it was there. The tomato plant smelled nice, but it wasn't really going to yield me anything. And so that's really going to be something informative for you, is just understanding where your direct sunlight is going to come from, and if you have any space in those areas to put plants in. And so your outdoor space, you can measure it, you can see how much, dimension wise you have to work with. So that's going to be pretty straightforward. Take a couple days to see what type of wildlife is around your neighborhood. For me, it's very much bunnies, squirrels, and birds, and whatever people happen to walk by with their dogs. I don't think there's much danger to that, but maybe you're in an area that has a lot of high traffic and your plants might be prone to getting knocked over. So just understanding your environment and what you'd have to work around. But most importantly, especially when you're container gardening in a small space, is don't underestimate the power of your indoor space. You can do a lot of container gardening inside just as much as you can outside, especially if you don't have a lot of outdoor space. So of course there is the obvious things when it comes to the direct sunlight that's coming through your windows, pushing plants towards those lights. But if you don't have a lot of that, look around your space to see what else you have. So maybe you have some cabinets that don't have a lot of storage in it right now, or don't have a lot of things in the storage right now, and you could potentially use that space for sprouts or mushrooms, things that really don't require light. You might also find that houseplants are your container plants, because they are container plants. They're not really going to yield you anything, but they are really nice to have in the space. I have several of them that have lasted me for years across multiple locations in all these different kinds of light, and they are very adaptable. A lot of them are. And then if you have the space, you can see if maybe you have room to have a dedicated space for indoor growing. And so for me here, I have set up a grow light that I got from a friend. And so really evaluating your space is probably one of the most important things to do first, because that's going to tell you what type of plants are going to give you the best yield, the best performance, and also understanding what zone you're in, your hardiness zone. So my next point is really connected to the first. Once you've understood your space, then start utilizing the space in the best way that you can. And so for the outdoor space, I would think about things like your containers that you're actually going to use. So if you want to really bring in a lot of plants, think about how big those containers need to be. I found in my experience that depth is a lot more valuable than width, and that does save some space. I can really put my containers next to each other because they're taking space this way and not this way. That's one of the things to consider with your containers when you purchase them. And you don't even have to purchase fancy containers. Sometimes just a bucket that you get from a Home Depot or somewhere in your garage, or maybe one that a friend has and isn't using, you can use those as well. Also think about drainage. If you're utilizing outdoor and indoor space with containers, think about the drainage you're gonna need for your plants. Some plants are gonna need some really good drainage, so pay attention when you're getting your containers, if they have holes in them, if they don't, and what that'll mean in terms of watering. And when you're indoors, like I said before, think about if you have space that can be dedicated to growing plants like I have here, or if there's space you need to share with other things, such as a cabinet, a dark cabinet, or just some shelf space where you can put a house plant. But if you do want dedicated space for growing plants, so maybe starting them from seed, or growing ones that you want to get bigger or to give you some yield, like a vegetable plant, I would recommend having somewhere in your space, it doesn't have to be fancy, a place where you can work on those plants, where they can grow, where you can regulate some of the environmental factors such as temperature and light. Where I am, the light isn't really regulated. I can't really regulate a ton of different factors because I'm in a very wide space here. My living space expands into my dining space, which is connected to my windows, so I can't really enclose them a ton. But what I did do was have that grow light there that I can turn on for the plants, and then I just made sure that I had a little bit of height storage instead of just length storage because of that space factor. And this is actually a shoe rack that I purchased because I found that that was less expensive than getting a dedicated garden shelf. And I wanted something specific that is just used for my plants. You can use whatever you have on hand, whatever furniture you have. All of my furniture was essentially used up, so I got something pretty inexpensive just so that I could stack plants on top and storage on the bottom. Another thing to consider, especially if you're starting off, is if you want to sprout things from seed or start with semi-grown plants like this. If you're starting off as a container gardener beginner, especially if you're not able to regulate a lot of factors for your seeds, or you don't have a lot of space to sprout a ton of seeds, I would recommend maybe going with just a sprout like this. This is something that I tend to favor, especially because I might not have enough sunlight or enough things to really make a plant grow from seed to full-blown plant. So I need a little bit of help. So these are just pepper plants that I got from a local farmer's market the other week. Because it's a little bit cold outside, they still need to stay inside for a little longer. But I found that this is really nice to get, because if I get it locally, most likely these are plants that can grow in my zone very well, and I can talk with the vendor directly to make sure that these are the right choice of plants for myself. So these are 2 pepper plants that will eventually go into their own containers and eventually go outside where they'll have plenty of sunlight. And then the final tip I have is to not give up and try multiple methods, especially with container gardening. It can be really frustrating because you think you have the factors right and then it just doesn't work. And that was my issue last season. I was growing garlic and mustard greens, as I said. I thought I found the right containers for the garlic, and I had a really nice long, fairly deep garden box for my greens, and I started some of them indoors and I started a few outdoors and see how they went. But unfortunately, the garlic, I don't think, just had enough sunlight to really create any sort of bulb underneath to be harvested. I did get a lot of green stalks for cooking, but nothing really beyond that. And for the mustard greens, unfortunately, they got a little overwatered at one point, and because I didn't thin them enough, they just never grew to full capacity. And so those were some really good things to know, but some of it was out of my control, such as when I put some of the garlic outside and the squirrels would come and dig their acorns in the soil, and I didn't realize that until much later and had to figure out how to keep them out of my container garden. And so some years are gonna feel like that, where it feels more of an experiment than actually planning on harvesting anything. And so my last growing season was very much an experiment, where I could start to see how much sunlight was needed for some of these plants, how effective this grow light was, if there were any factors that I hadn't considered that I needed to incorporate. And I also kept a journal for it. Definitely keep this around as you go through multiple seasons of container gardening. You can put down, what works, what didn't, maybe some pricings on some things that you're looking at, and then you can look back on it, and that'll be really helpful. I know one of the biggest things that I remember being told was to try multiple locations for your container, and because they're transportable, that's really easy. And if you live in a small space like me, maybe in an apartment complex where you don't have a lot of outside property, don't be afraid to reach out to people in your community. So maybe you have a friend who has some space where you can do some container gardening over there, or maybe you have the ability to talk to the person who manages your apartment complex or whatever neighborhood you live in. I know for me this season, that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be reaching out to my apartment complex manager to ask them if I can just take a couple containers if I can take a couple containers and put them on the west back side of my apartment, where we don't really get a lot of traffic, but there's a lot of great light, and as long as it's non-intrusive to anything, if I could grow things there. So don't be afraid to ask questions, to experiment, to record your findings, and hopefully it becomes a very rewarding process for you. And I hope this gives people some ideas on how they can garden in small spaces. It's totally possible. You need to get a little creative, need to be a little resilient, just like any gardener, but there will be some awards for it. And I think a lot of satisfaction with the realization that even though you live in a small space, gardening is also for you. So thanks everyone for watching. I hope you got something from this, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.